So my name is Corey Nelson. I'm one of the co-designers of Chivalry is Dead Race for the Crown. My son and I did the design on this game. One of the requests that we've had is to put together a video that kind of walks through the setup of the game along with just the basic gameplay, some of the errata or explanation about some special circumstances you run into. So this video is designed to do just that. This is how we explain it to people at conventions. So hopefully it will make sense and make your introduction to the game a little bit better. We definitely recommend reading the rule set completely, but this should give a fairly decent introduction. Now for this, I am using the Tabletop Simulator version simply because it does have a lot of the cards in there. It is not all of the cards for sure that exist in the game. It does give a good sampling of it, but it should work well for this particular purpose. So to start with the goal of the game. The goal, you are playing one of several different teams. The goal is to basically get one of your chariots around the track. You're going to be doing 1 or 2 laps, depending on how long you want to play for. We recommend 1 lap in most cases, especially for your first few games. You can complete a lap in an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you're still learning the game. 2 laps is going to take a lot longer. More of the chariots will ultimately die, although a 1 lap game plays really well. It is what we typically recommend in the cases of conventions and such. During those laps, you are trying to avoid the various pieces of terrain, and of course you're attacking the other chariots, they're attacking you, you're effectively trying to survive. It's a little bit of a Ben-Hur meets D&D, if you will. So let's talk about setup. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to set up the board. So on the board itself, you'll notice we have these terrain pieces. We've got rocks and we've got water. So the rocks get placed on the rock locations of the map. They can place on this. The water gets placed on top of the mud locations. Now, if there are no tokens on these, they have no effect. They are here so that you have valid locations to put these each time you play, so you can kind of adjust it a little bit. Second thing we're going to want to do is we're going to decide which team do we want to play with. So the base game has 4 separate teams. There are 3 additional ones in the expansion. Each of these teams does play a little bit differently. So if we look at our kobolds here, for example, they are using a resilient build. That is a build that is designed around drivers, specifically control of the chariot. And if we look at here, you'll notice I've got 3 different chariots, and all 3 are using the resilient build. That is the kobold's default. Additionally, kobolds do have an oil trap, so that is one of their unique team abilities. If we come over here and look at goblins, goblins are a little bit different. They're an offensive build across the board, and they've got relentless, which gives them the ability to reroll an attack. So each of the teams does play a little differently. To set up our teams, what we're going to do is we're going to first decide on a team. We're going to then decide how many chariots are we playing. Now, really the ideal rule of thumb is getting 12 chariots on the field. That we find is kind of the ideal sweet spot, if you will. If I'm playing 3 or 4 chariots, then I'm going to play, or 3 or 4 teams, I'm going to play a full 3 chariots per team. If I start introducing the expansions and such, though, I'm probably going to expand that a little bit or shorten that a little bit. If I were to play like 6 teams, for example, I might play just 2 chariots a piece just to get myself close to that 12 chariot piece. But it really depends on how long of a game you want to play. Then I'm going to set up my chariots. So for each of my chariots, first I'm going to decide on a build. There's a card here which is not in the Tabletop Simulator, but it lays right over here while the kobolds do play resilient builds. They do have one card that is a speed build, one that's an offensive build, one that's a defensive build, and that can be placed right over this card to change them out. So for example, the goblins are offensive. I can make, as a kobold, one of my guys offensive. I can't make all 3 of them offensive, but I can make one offensive. So that's a choice I can make. Additionally, I'm going to choose a perk. So each team has 4 to 6 different perks associated with the team itself. I can pick 1 per chariot. They are, for the most part, unique per team. So kobolds have the bomb trap. They're the only ones that get the bomb trap. They've got a spike trap. Over here, both the goblins and the kobolds actually have the spike trap available to them. I am going to set my tokens. These tokens here, if they've got slots, are going to be placed on top. If I'm playing a 2-lap game, I'm going to put both chariots or both the tokens. If I'm playing a 1 lap, I'm going to reduce it by 1. So I'll have 1 empty slot for a 1-lap game. And then the last thing I'm going to do on my kobolds here is I'm going to set up my dual dial. So each chariot has a dual dial. You'll note here we have the chariot number 2 with the chariot number 2 dual dial. This is effectively the health of the chariot. So I've got my driver health, my left wheel, my right wheel, my max speed, my current speed, and then my control points. So all of these, when I set it up, are going to be maxed out to whatever the top line is, with the exception of control points. Control points I'm going to pull from here. It's going to be 3 or 4 depending on my character, and so I'm going to adjust that accordingly. And that's really it. That's all I need to do to set up my chariots themselves. So everybody's going to set up their chariots. We've got our board set up. Then we are going to decide the starting order of our chariot in our chariot race. To decide the turn order, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my selection deck, and I'm going to pull these cards one by one, and then I'm going to place them starting with this location here, and I'm going to start placing them around the map or around the track. When I run out of space, they're going to go into the second row. Now, don't worry too much if your guys end up in the second row. It doesn't really matter too terribly much. There are sometimes advantages to going in the back row, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more in a moment. So I did want to take one more note here about all the cards. You will see here there are a bunch of cards on the board. These guys have abilities that are different than mine. Do not make that worry you in the slightest. You don't need to worry about anything anybody else has. Generally speaking, they're cards. You can't stop them anyway. As long as you understand your team abilities and your perks, you're pretty much golden. So once everybody's laid out the chariots, we've got the board, we've set up our chariot teams, we are good to start the game. So in turn 1, on each turn, what happens is that each chariot gets a chance to move. So we use our deck here, and we would basically draw a card, and it's Goblin 1. So Goblin 1's turn would go first. So Goblin 1 is in the back, so this is a good example. So Goblin 1 is in the back. If he's in the back and there is no slot available, then his card would go to the bottom of the deck, and he would just go later. Now, if there are any slots available, let's say that this guy had already gone. Now, if there's any valid location, however, he could then be placed up in that location. He could start there for free. Now, during this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and play as the kobolds. So we're going to pretend that Kobold 3's turn is next. So during his turn, he has 2 phases. The first is an optional charge phase. The second is a movement phase. So the optional charge phase, this is effectively a bonus movement. It's one of the 3 uses of your control points. So control points can be used to charge. They can be used to reduce damage on a turn, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And they also can be used to heal your animals if they get damaged later on. But we're going to go ahead and decide to go and use our control points to charge. So we would reduce our control points by 1. And we would come over here and we would basically take a die and we would roll the die. Let's give it a little bit better roll than that. Okay, I didn't roll very well. I rolled a 1. That's okay. I take 1 and I'm going to add my driver score. 2. So he gets a movement phase here of 3 squares. And the way that works is it's 1, 2, 3. It's 1 basically for each square he gets to move. Now when we move, we can move sideways. It costs 1 movement. However, you need to move forward each time you move sideways. So for example, if I was back here, I could have gone 1. Couldn't have gone any far. Couldn't have made a lane change because I'd be in their spot. I could go 2, and then I could do that to move 3. So that's an option. So I didn't go very far during my charge phase. I can't do anything else. I can't use abilities unless the abilities specifically specify. There are some that let you like re-roll it and things like that. I can't drop off traps or anything wacky like that. But I can do the little mini charge. And again, normally I'd roll a little bit higher than that. Now I have my movement phase. Now during my movement phase, I need to move my current speed, and I need to use all of the movement. So my current speed is 20. It's going to start out like that. So now to move my 20, I'm going to go through and I'm going to count those out. I might change lanes to get around water and other chariots and such. Now there is a little marker here. We do recommend you use this because you can kind of place it wherever it is you're at, and then you can count them out, especially if you've got more of a complicated move. Now during my movement, I can also attack the chariot. So to attack him, in order to attack, I need the back of my chariot to be lined up with his chariot in some way. So if I look at this, my back is lined up with the square behind him. That wouldn't work. If I were here, it would. If I were here, while it is lined up with the animals, I can still attack there, and I can attack any target. So basically, to attack, I would come up next to him. I would use one movement to attack him. In order to attack, I need to first choose a target. So if we look at the chariots, I've got 3 valid targets. I've got the driver. I can attack this on either side of the chariot. I have the left wheel and right wheel. This depends on my direction. So if we look here, I am on his right side, so I would be attacking his right wheel if I were to attack the wheel. I can also attack the animals to reduce the max speed. So what happens is animals will reduce max speed ultimately. Any damage goes through there, and that's going to slow them down. Driver is going to choose 2 things. Number one, it's a little bit easier to attack it because you can hit it from either side of the chariot. Additionally, if I were to stun the chariot, I would put a stun card on, and that basically stops him from using his team ability or his perk for 1 turn. It goes off at the end of his following turn. Additionally, if I attack the wheels, and the wheels, if you're not sure, are usually the good solid target to hit, it's going to reduce the wheels down. If wheels or driver go to 0, the chariot is destroyed. And in a normal 1-lap game, anywhere from 40 to 60% of these chariots should be destroyed regardless. Additionally, the reason we recommend the wheel as the core target is when you get down into this red zone, there's a higher, he has to do a flip check to see if he flips over by himself. So you can come in and you can do just a few points of damage to the wheel. He rolls really badly and he actually gets destroyed right off the bat. Now, regardless of the target that we make, the attack is going to work the same way. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll a die. We've got a 4. We're going to add our 1 to the attack. I guess it's this guy right here. Add 1, so 5. And then we're going to subtract his defense. Now I happen to know his defense is 4, so we're going to take 1 point of damage is going to go down to on whatever his chariot is. And so he's going to reduce that on his dial. Really as simple as that. If he's got any flip checks, if he gets into this red zone, he's got to do a flip check. He's going to roll that die. One thing does happen on a 1 or an 8. If you roll a 1, it is a counterattack, so he can then counter me. If I roll an 8, what would actually happen is it would have pushed him a square over, and that can push him off the map. It can push him into terrain. It can push him into other chariots and things along those lines. Now let's say I did enough damage to him to where he took damage into that little red section, into that red zone. Let's use this guy as our goblin, as our case study. And let's say his wheel was all the way down to 5. So he would need to do a flip check. Anytime he takes damage and it's in the red zone, he's got to do that check. So wheel is 5. He's got a driver score of 2. He's going to add that value. So 5 plus 2 is 8. 5 plus 2 is 7. And he needs to then roll below a 7. If he rolls a 7 or an 8, he flips. He rolled an 8. Okay, so if he flips, we look at this lovely little chart over here. And 8 is going to be 2 squares in front of his chariot. So a couple of things. If we look at this, sorry, the controls are a little bit wonky here. We're going to put a piece of debris is going to land right there. Don't love the placement on there, but Tabletop Simulator, what can you do? And then he's going to drop off the board. That's him basically destroyed. Debris is a ton of damage, which we'll talk about just in a moment. So that's really how the flip checks work. They're fairly simple in that regard. Additionally, if he had taken enough damage to his driver to where it was 0, he would also die in that particular circumstance. Now, once that is done, that is just one movement, and then he would continue on. Now, the odds of him killing him in one shot is kind of slim, but it's a thing. Okay, now he can only attack one chariot per turn. So if he comes in here and attacks him, he cannot move forward and then attack him again. If there were another chariot, let's say right here, he could come in, attack him, move forward a couple, and then attack him again. He can attack as many chariots in one turn as he wants, but he cannot attack the same chariot twice. Additionally, during the movement, there are a lot of abilities that affect you during your movement. So for example, our kobold here has an oil trap. During his movement, it's a free action. He can basically drop the oil trap right in front of this guy. because why not? That way he's going to hit it next turn. Remember, you always have to move forward in order to change lanes. So the dwarf doesn't really have an ability that lets him just change lanes. So if I drop that there, next turn he's going to run right into it. So that's another thing I can do during my movement phase. Again, watch your abilities. A lot of them are based off of or used during the movement. Some of them are during charge and things along those lines. Now let's talk briefly about terrain. So we mentioned before we have rocks and we have water. So the way these work is if I were to land on a rock, I'm going to roll a d8. I'm going to add, it's a +1 if it's a little rock or a +2 if it's a big rock. And I'm going to take that number and I'm going to subtract my defense against that, and any damage is going to go through to my chariot. Now I can use that, I can balance it out between my two wheels. So if I roll low, it's not really going to do a whole lot, but if I roll really badly, especially late in the game, it could potentially destroy my chariot. Now if I roll, if I hit water, then what happens is that this water causes my wheels to spin. It doesn't strictly slow me down. If I'm moving 20, I'm still moving 20 at the end of this. But let's say I was doing 13. I went 11, 12, I hit 13, I hit the water. What I would do here is I would go roll my dice, 7, 13 plus 7 is 20. My max movement's 20, so it's going to drop me. It's going to stop me right there in the water. So basically, you roll the die and you add that as if you had moved that number of squares. Now let's say that we've finished our first turn, and obviously for demo purposes I've removed quite a few chariots off the board. On the beginning of our second turn, all the chariots in play have the option of changing their current speed. So if we look at our dual dial here, we've got our current speed, we've got our max. We can adjust our current speed as long as it's at or below the max speed. Now why would we want to do that? Well, the big reason I might want to slow down a little bit is that I'm about to enter a big curve. Now these numbers here, consider these speed limits for lack of a better term. Let's say we're moving 20 and I entered this 14 square. If I enter this 14 at 20, I'm going 6 above the limit. Therefore, I'm going to automatically take 6 points to my outside wheel. In this case, it's going to be my left wheel because it's on the outside lane. Now, I can reduce that damage. That is another purpose of a control point. And in that case, what I would do is I would come in here. I would reduce my control point by 1. I would take another die. I would roll it. And I'd reduce it, in this case, 7. I would add my driver score of 2, and I'd reduce it by 9. So I can fly past this and go 6 above, no problem. But if I roll a 1 or something like that, I'm going to take a lot of damage to my chariot, so I don't necessarily want to do that. Now, that check is done anytime I enter the lane on my turn. Anytime I change to a tighter lane, here I need to check again, and the damage does stack. Or let's say I finish my turn here and I go to my next turn. At the beginning of my movement phase, it would check again. It does not check if I go to a wider lane, and if I go to a larger number, even if I'm over, let's say I was at 20, and I did my check, I took my damage or reduced it, and then I decided to go to a 16, I don't have to do the check again because I'm going to a wider one. Now, there are a couple of caveats with this. Number one, it only affects you during the movement phase, not the charge phase. What that means is if I start my turn here, let's say I decide I want to go 18 and I start my turn here. Well, if I were to decide to charge, I could step 1, 2 and charge and get into my 18, and it wouldn't check until the movement phase. So that's one important note. Additionally, when we get into these elements with the water, there are ways you can use the fact that this can only affect you once per turn to your advantage. So what can happen is, let's say I wanted to go 10. I'm going to go to, I know I'm going to take a couple points of damage. I'm going to go through this 8. I go 1. I roll my dice. I go 3. So 8. I take 1. I've now moved 4. 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to get stuck basically right about there. Right? So I didn't make it very far because the water slowed me down a little bit. But what I can do is I can use a control point to charge. Let's say I rolled my 3. I had 1 because let's say I've got a driver of +1, 3, so I'm going to move 4. So I move 1. I had a full charge of 4. I used 1 to get here, and then I rolled a 5, so that 5 reduced me down to 0. So I'm stuck in the mud. Nothing's happened. However, Now I'm on my movement phase, and this water cannot affect me twice per turn, which means now I can move my normal movement, whatever my 10 was, and maybe try to get out of the lane, or maybe I'd probably be right about there. So I can use that to my advantage. Additionally, in cases like this, let's say I ended my turn there, I could, because the speed on here only affects me on my movement phase, I could use a charge out of it, and then not have to worry about the fact that I am starting my turn with my tail in that area. So there are some things that you can do to kind of take advantage of that on your turns. Now let's talk about some special circumstances. So one would be starting behind another chariot like this. So our kobold is starting his turn right here. He always has to go forward in order to change lanes, right? So naturally he would collide. However, there are some rules here for this specific situation. First option, there's 3 options in total. First option, he can take his selection card, he can put it in the bottom of the deck and go last. Option number 2, there is a rule that states if I skip my charge phase and I go directly to my movement phase and I'm stuck in literally this position, I can use 1 movement to move sideways and move around. Only affects it if you start right behind it. If I were to start like here, for example, I couldn't use that rule. Now, I can still potentially collide, because let's say this guy was over here and maybe this guy was over here and he's got nowhere to go. He would have to collide into him. He has no choice there at all, assuming he's the last one to go. This is where you'd want to put your card in the bottom and let that dwarf hopefully get out of the way. So what happens when you collide? Well, when you collide, effectively it is the same die roll that happens when you attack, but it's not an attack. 1s and 8s have no effect whatsoever. There's no such thing as a slam attack, which is your 8. There's no such thing as a counter. But these two do damage potentially to each other. So he would roll the same die. It would be a d8 plus his attack roll against the dwarf's defense. Because he's hitting him from behind, the dwarf would decide where that damage goes, and he'd split it between his wheels. The dwarf would roll his attack against the kobold, but because he's hitting the front of his chariot, it would be basically against the animals. So same basic rules as an attack. 1s and 8s don't do anything, and they both technically roll against each other as they slam into each other. Now there are some other cases where this can come into play. So for example, if this kobold were moving along, in this case, he would potentially collide into the dwarf. But because he's colliding from the side, he would choose, do I hit the animals? Do I hit the chariot? Do I hit the driver? Just like an attack. An attack is effectively a hit from the side. This dwarf, because it's a collision, would then roll the same thing against the kobold, but it would basically hit the animals because that's the only valid target. So the direction of the hit is really what matters for both collisions and attacks. Similarly, if our kobold were here and he were to run in front of this guy and attack, his only valid target would be the animals in that particular case. Okay, so what about lane issues? It's our kobold's turn. Kobold, he's kind of getting blocked off by these dwarves. Our main path, as you can see, is along this line. It is perfectly legal for him to come in and go outside the lane. In fact, he can go way over here if he's got the movement to do it, in order to go around this dwarf. However, keep in mind, if he hits here, as soon as he goes off that track, he's dead. So he's got to make sure he works himself around, but that is perfectly legal. So how do we determine who wins? So the first check is done as soon as any of these chariots gets past does their full lap or 2 and gets past the line. All chariots that have not moved get to move. So the determination is at the end of a turn. If there's at least one chariot that's finished the race, then you determine who's the winner. It's based off of the chariot that is the furthest in the lap, and that's based on number of squares passed. So in this case, they've actually tied. However, in the case of a tie, it's whoever's closest to the inside lane that would win. So in this case, the kobold 3 would have won. If he was up a little bit, it would have been this guy. Now keep in mind, if this chariot had come in here, let's say he made it that way, he comes in and he slams into this guy and then destroys him. Well, it goes to dwarf number 2 because the chariot's got to be alive at the end of that turn. So that really is a victory condition. While it's technically a race, the advantage goes to the one that's still alive. So hopefully that helped. That is a brief breakdown on kind of how the gameplay works. And feel free to email us if you've got any questions.